Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. We have a real treat today, actually a very special treat, one of my favourite authors. Scott Mariani is the #1 Sunday Times best-selling author of the multi-million selling Ben Hope thrillers, absolutely fabulous books. He has just launched into a new historical adventure series featuring medieval English hero Will Bowman, who is forced from his home to join King Richard the Lionheart on the Third Crusade and rises to become a knight. The first in the series, The Pilgrim's Revenge, has just come out. So, hi Scott, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, and nice to be here. Thank you very much for having me on. It's a real pleasure.
It's a pleasure for us too. I have to ask, after writing such a fantastic modern thriller series, albeit always with a historical twist, what made you move to historical fiction?
Well, first, thank you for your kind comments about the Ben Hope books. I mean, that was a long series. It took me many years to write that, and we got to 30 books. I never thought that would happen. When you start, you don't know whether you'll ever write more than one, and then you get 2, 3, 4, and then it just adds up, and it just added up and up and up over the years, and ended up with 30 books. I still can't believe that it's 30 books long. And I'm very fortunate that it struck a chord with people, and that people loved it, and so many people have loved it, and I'm deeply grateful for the support of all these readers that have followed the series for so many years. But all things come to an end, I guess. And after 30 books, well, it wasn't after 30 books that I decided I wanted to stop. It was really after about 28, I began to think to myself that it was time for something new. And what triggered that was The Tudor Deception, which was book 28, I think, in the series. And you know what it's like. I was writing one book every 6 months, and every single book most of them had a historical background. But every 6 months, whatever it might be, whether it's the American Civil War, or whether it's the Russian Revolution, or whether it's whatever it might be, ancient China, or any of these other subjects. And it's been hopping about through all of history, from the ancient to the relatively modern. And you're just hopping about like a flea on a dog's back from one subject to another. And you never get more than 6 months to really dig into it. And while doing The Tudor Deception, set in later medieval England with Richard III and the princes in the tower and all that stuff, it was such fun to research. But during that time, I just thought, I really like being in this time setting, although ultimately I've chosen an earlier one. But I really loved the medieval era. It's just something that I've always loved. I'm not a historian, but I've always been passionate about history and different parts of history, but especially the medieval era. And I just thought, this is just great. I love being here. I love doing this. Is there any way I can go on doing that permanently, rather than have to just up stakes and move on to some other period I might not be quite so interested in after 6 months? And this way, then, selfishly, I thought to myself, well, maybe I should just, after 30 books, 30 is a good number, but I thought, yeah, maybe it's time. Maybe this would be a good time to switch and do something new. And it would have to be a historical series where I just get to plant myself in one period of history and stay there. And that was a gamble. It was a huge gamble. It was a terrible decision to have to make. I remember calling my editor and saying, look, this is what I'm thinking about doing. I don't think she was very pleased, but I had to do it. I had to follow my heart. And I'm very glad I did, although I've had a lot of sleepless nights over it. It was a big jump to make.
I can understand that.
You just don't know if your readers are going to follow you. You don't know how many people are going to like it. You don't know how many new readers you might get. You just don't know. The whole thing could be a horrible disaster. But I'm pleased to say that so far it looks as if it's not actually a horrible disaster. it's going quite well. It's not. I'm happy with it, and the publishers are happy, and I'm having fun. I'm really having fun doing this.
Well, I really enjoyed The Pilgrim's Revenge. Like you say, when you're going in a new direction, it's like, are they going to like it? And I was worried that there wouldn't be as many people getting killed and as many fights, but no, no worries on that score.
You want to do? We want more death, more violence,
It's the action. I like the action.
sword fights, and all that. Well, you'll be pleased to hear that in the second book, which I've just finished yesterday. I just finished writing the second one yesterday evening. I wrote 3,000 words yesterday. I was really rushing to get it done. But you'll be happy to hear that there's much, much more battles and big epic stuff with, sieges and huge cavalry charges and all that stuff going on in the second book. It's bigger in scale generally than the first. So lots of violence, lots of blood, lots of people getting run through with great big swords, and lots of people getting shot with arrows and crossbow bolts. So you'll love it.
That sounds good. Just up my street.
Well, certainly, if you're looking for bloodshed, you chose a real corker for your first foray into historical fiction with the Third Crusade. There's plenty of scope there. So, what made you pick that particular period, though? Because obviously, as you've said, you've dabbled in loads of different periods of history. Why did you start with the Third Crusade?
Mainly because it's cool. Because to me it's the coolest of all the Crusades. I mean, after the third one, from the fourth one onwards, they kind of lost their way a bit. The third one was just great. You've got these really cool characters. You've got these iconic characters of Richard the First, of course, who's the kind of star of the show, and Saladin, who's just the ultimate. I'm not going to call him a baddie. He was the enemy. But whether you dress him up as a chivalric hero or whether you dress him up as the evil dictator or whatever, but he is certainly one of the coolest antagonists you're ever going to find. And I think that was probably a large part of my choice. I mean, the first Crusade is a pretty amazing story as well. But to be honest, some of the things that were done in it, I would leave a terrible taste in your mouth. If you had a heroic character like my hero Will Bowman, and you put him into the first Crusade, and they went off and they sacking Jerusalem, and the things that were done and the massacre that was done there, but the atrocities that were committed were quite appalling, and I don't think there's any way you can really fit your hero into that without him rebelling against it. You've always got to be very careful of your hero's moral compass. You can't have him or her involved in stuff that's just so beyond the pale that your readers just can't forgive it. That was part of why I didn't want to go with the first Crusade. Third one, because it was glorious. You have these amazing battles. The Siege of Acre, which went on for something like 2 years. You have the Battle of Arsuf. You have the conquest of Jaffa, of Jerusalem. Well, it didn't really happen with Jerusalem, but all these amazing moments, and it's very well written about. You have very detailed chronicles to work with. The Itinerarium Peregrinorum. Forgive my appalling Latin pronunciation here, but you have these amazing chronicles which really go through it in detail.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, I really had this resource that I could just follow to a large degree, and it was like drinking out of a fire hose. You just have all this stuff coming at you, all this information pouring out of the pages of these chronicles, and you think, wow, how could I possibly fit all this into a story? It's more a question of what to leave out, really.
Yeah. Welcome to my world.
Yeah, and it wasn't mine because, I used to have to make up these stories for a living, but now all of a sudden I'm just kind of rehashing what's already happened and trying. It's a bit like that movie Zelig, with Woody Allen, where this character Zelig keeps appearing. It's quite an old film. He keeps appearing at different points in history. And you have to insert your, you know all about this.
Yeah.
Of course, I think you've done this loads of times yourselves, but you have to insert your character into these scenarios that have already happened. But in terms of the actual detail of the events and the dates and the sequence of events, it's all there for you. It's all laid out for you, which is a strange new experience for me.
I hadn't realised how much Richard the Lionheart, Richard the First, must have been the King of Spin, because he actually took chroniclers with him.
Yeah. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, I guess, and they were pretty much told what to write.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've been looking at it from every side. Like, there are quite lot of different chronicles. Some of them were written later, much later, decades later. So you can't always rely on the detail, on the accuracy of the detail. And then, of course, you have the Muslim side
Yes.
chronicles there as well. So I've been taking all that on board as well, as much as I can. Although we don't really spend a lot of time with the other side, so to speak. But it was good to look at it from all sides, rather than just get the probably exaggerated version that you get from the Richard's own writers. Obviously, there to laud him and sing his praises and extol his virtues. I'm sure he had plenty of virtues, but a lot of it's probably highly exaggerated as well.
Yeah.
It's been great fun picking my way through all this stuff. I really love it. I love being so deeply immersed in the history of it.
And reading The Pilgrim's Revenge got me thinking about the logistics of going on crusade, because you have Will depart his home and arrive at the port where they're trying to load the army onto ships, transporting horses, supplies, the risks of sea travel.
Yeah.
And you actually get across this idea that everything's manic trying to get organized.
I'm sure it was extremely manic. They had ships departing all the time. They left from various ports. Many of the ships left from France. They left from southern France. Richard departed from Marseille. He had traveled overland down from his little corner, the Angevin Empire, and he'd come down with the army overland to Marseille and left from there. Whereas the English contingents left from various ports. Wills leaves from Southampton. And rather than sail across the channel and then march down through what we now call France, they didn't do that. They sailed right round the edge. They sailed right round the coast of France, right round Spain, and down by Portugal, and then went through Gibraltar, and came through that way, which was an amazing journey and very dangerous journey and very long months to happen. I don't quite know why they did it that way rather than march overland, but when you have to transport thousands of troops and all of the supplies and the horses especially, they take up a lot of room. They're very heavy, and they drink a hell of a lot of water. And water is always a scarce commodity on board ship. If you had maybe 40 war horses on board your ship, half your cargo spaces, and you'd have to get the carpenters in and build, all kinds of stalls and things for them. Mostly mercantile vessels that had to be adapted specially for this purpose. So you've got all these horses on board, and the thousands of gallons of water that they're drinking every week has to be replenished constantly. They'd have to put in to many ports on the way. So they could never really stay too far away from a coast, creep around the edge everywhere, and then hope that they could put in somewhere and get some friendly port where they could get supplies. I don't know how they did it. It's quite remarkable how they did it, and I'm sure that there was a lot went wrong as well. We don't really hear about that, but I'm sure that a lot went wrong, and many ships were lost as well. Because you have all the storms to deal with, and then you have pirates, and you have all this other stuff going on, which is what really appealed to me, because it's an incredibly difficult journey. And I just thought, yeah, this is great. This is the stuff that adventure is made of. Absolutely attracted me, the idea of doing this long sea voyage. Much of the book, it's almost a naval story in many ways. Because ultimately they travel all the way, then they get to Marseille, and then they have to depart again, and they travel all the way down to Sicily, and then they spend time in Sicily, and then Cyprus. So we never get to the Holy Land. We only get as far as Cyprus, and then we can sort of gaze across, and we can see the mountains and the forests of the Holy Land in the distance, but we don't get there until book 2. Yeah, the logistics were awesome, and of course it was very expensive, extremely expensive. Which was why Richard had to really plunder England and his kingdom for all the money he could get. And he raised this tax, very unpopular tax called the Saladin tithe, which was a 10% tax. Can you believe it? They had rioting in the streets over 10% tax. We're paying, up to 40% nowadays. I don't see them rioting in the streets over it, but we just grumble. But yeah, so he raised this tax, deeply unpopular, and he stripped money from the church, and they didn't like that very much. But it was all to pay for this, You would bankrupt yourself completely going to war. You think all the nobles that joined the Third Crusade and all the Crusades, they wouldn't be mortgaging their castles; they'd be selling off their lands. They would get on ship with nothing, and if they ran out of money on the journey, they might have to go and put themselves in the service of some higher up noble or somebody with more money than them, or a king. This is what happened to many of them, and they were completely broken by it financially. Came home very often if they survived. They'd come home with nothing. They'd come home to nothing because they had no land and no title, no nothing. Poor things had to be like the rest of us and work for a living. Yeah, I mean, it was a massive enterprise, and it's hard for us to even imagine the scale of enthusiasm that many of them must have had for it to take such risks. It's quite incredible.
It does explain as well, though, why I mean, Richard the First, he took the cross in, was it 1187 or 1188 or something, but they didn't depart until 1190, because it's, like you say, it's a massive undertaking of organization and working out where and when to meet people, because it wasn't just the English contingent, there was a French one and a German one.
It was truly international. Yeah, Richard took the cross before he was king. He took the cross as soon as he heard the news of what had happened, the famous Battle of Hattin, the Horns of Hattin, where Guy de Lusignan, who was king of Jerusalem, by luck just became this king of Jerusalem by marriage. And he was an incompetent soldier and an incompetent leader and a terrible king. And he led his army. Everybody knows the story. We've seen Kingdom of Heaven. It's quite well depicted in that film. And they basically got massacred. And as a result of that, Saladin took Jerusalem, and they took the one true cross, which was this incredible icon that the army were carrying with them. It was then taken as a trophy by the Saracens, and it was a complete disaster. It was so awful that the Pope, when he got the news a couple of weeks later, brought back by merchant ships from the Holy Land. When the Pope heard the news of what had happened, he just dropped dead, or so the legend goes. He just put his hand on his chest and went, whoa, and dropped dead. And Richard was so inflamed by the news of that. He said, right, that's it, we've got to do something here. So as soon as the call came out, right, boys, we've got to go and do something about this. He was the first one to sign up and say, yeah, all right, okay, I want to do this. But as you say, it took a long time for them to get themselves organized and actually set off, partly for financial reasons. They had to put their affairs in order. They had to raise the money. They had to get everything organized, all the ships built or hired for it. There was also a big problem with Richard and the rivalry between Richard and Philippe. Neither of them would really budge until the other one did, because they didn't trust each other. Richard was convinced, not wrongly, that the moment his back was turned, if he set off, the Philippe would see his opportunity and would move in and try and nick his lands in Aquitaine and Anjou, because Richard's kingdom wasn't just England, of course. People think of Richard as king of England, but actually his terrain was much bigger than that. Most of what we now think of as France. But so Richard was very concerned that Philippe, whose kingdom was actually smaller, it was just the sort of remainder of France that Richard didn't control. He thought that Philippe might. Where did he get this idea from? That Philippe would move in and try and nick his land. And of course, this later did happen. Later on, Philippe got in cahoots with John, with Richard's brother, and they conspired behind Richard's back, and may even have been instrumental in Richard getting kidnapped on the way home from the Third Crusade, just so that they could get him out of the way and move in on his act, hoping that he'd never come home. So there was all this corruption going on, all this skullduggery going on, which I love. I love getting into all that, and that was one of the reasons why it was so delayed.
Yeah, I guess all the organization that they needed to get there was huge, but the fact that they did it shows the strength of their desire to go, which I sort of get the idea of. It's kind of a blend or a cross between their sort of faith and their spirit of adventure. It's not just faith. It's the idea that these particularly young men, but these men can go off to war and they can fight for a holy cause. It's a kind of blend of the two, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there was probably an element of tally ho, chaps, off we go. Like the First World War had an element of that before they realized what an absolute horrific bloodbath it was going to be. But when everybody thought the war would only last a couple of weeks and it was all going to be jolly good fun, and off we go. And the Boer War was the same. All the young chaps all went off, and this is going to be great. Wonderful bit of adventure. And yeah, there was probably an element of that as well. Hey, we're going off to fight the Saracens and reclaim the kingdom of God, and it's going to be really cool. And we'll be back home in a month.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was this deeply devotional element of it, and I'm not a fan of the term crusade particularly, because the term, I said this there's an author's note at the end of the book, and I had to say it because they didn't consider themselves crusaders. They didn't call themselves crusaders. That term wasn't used until much later on, and they had no notion of going on a crusade as we understand it now. I think that word has overtones of this very kind of aggressive, colonialist sort of militaristic enterprise. But it wasn't really like that. I mean, they were peregrini. They were pilgrims. That's how they regarded themselves. It was an armed pilgrimage. It was an armed quasi-military pilgrimage, very much so. Of course it was. And they knew they were going to have to fight when they got there. But at the same time, there is this very strong devotional aspect to it, which we don't really understand now in our secular age. No. At least we in the West don't understand it. There are other cultures that understand it very well still, and they're very driven by that in many ways. But we struggle with that. We struggle with that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It certainly wasn't a war. It certainly wasn't a campaign. I mean, people did do well out of it. Of course they did. Some did. But it wasn't generally a campaign or a series of campaigns fought for money. I think some of the later crusades you can accuse them of that more. There was more corruption going on, and there was more greed going on. Sometimes crusade commanders would lie to the troops and tell them they were going to one place when actually, in fact, they weren't going there at all. You wouldn't know where you were until you got off the ship and you think, hang on, weren't we supposed to be in Egypt or something? What are we doing? What are we doing in Constantinople? Oh, we've got to sack this place now, and we've got to rip all the gold out, and oh, okay. and that was the Fourth Crusade, and it was rather ugly, and another reason for going with the Third Crusade, because it was more pure in spirit.
Yeah, you include some of the Portuguese campaign. What prompted you to do that?
Because it happened. I didn't know that much about it, and I was going through the chronicles, and of course I'm looking for adventure. I'm looking for, cool set pieces that I can include. And so they're sailing down through the Bay of Biscay, and they're sailing down the coast of Spain, and there's storms and all terrible things happening. And then they got and in the chronicle, there's this not very detailed section. I can't remember which chronicle it was now. They got washed up on a shore, and they didn't really know where they were at first. And then these people arrived on shore, and it was the recently Christianized kingdom of Portugal. Now, the previous year, we're in 1190 here. So the previous year, they'd actually had the Moors had been in control of Silves, is the port town and castle where this action takes place, right down in the south of Portugal. And in 1189, there was a battle there because the city had to be liberated by the Christians from the Moors. And then a year later, in 1190, this is when our hero Will arrives there. The opposite is happening. So it's held by the Christians at that point, and hasn't been held for very long by the Christians, only a year. And the Moors are coming back. They're coming back to reclaim it. So there was this not very detailed account, and I had to really dig a bit to find out more about this. But it was just such a splendid piece of adventure to include. And of course, it's our hero's first serious brush with war, with battle. He's been in a couple of fights, and as he's going through England, he has to fight some bandits, some brigands, and he gets into the occasional scrape, but nothing like this. And so now you've got full-on siege happening. You've got thousands of troops advancing on a castle walls. You've got siege engines. You've got the siege towers. You've got the whole works happening. And you've got poor Will up on the battlement. He's 20 years old. He's never been in a battle before. And because he's got a bow, the Portuguese commander takes one look at him and says, okay, you come with me up on the battlements, and he's put in charge of this contingent of archers. He doesn't know what he's doing. Hasn't got a clue. Probably something akin to Lord of the Rings, Helm's Deep, the siege of Helm's Deep, where you have 10,000 orcs advancing on the fortifications, and you just got to deal with it. And they managed to repel this Moorish army, which had come from Morocco, and they managed to actually rescue the city. And it was just a handful of them, and it's amazing how they did that. But so I thought, yeah, well, you got to do this. You've got to put your hero into the middle of that. And it took up a lot of time in the book itself. I had to cover that in quite a lot of detail. But I think it's a relatively little known episode in that crusade.
It is. I came across it when writing the biography of Nicola de la Haye, because her brother-in-law, Richard de Canville, was one of the officers in the Portuguese campaign. His ship had landed in Portugal as well. So I was like, when I started reading it, I thought, oh, well done. Most people just totally ignore that bit of and either skip to Sicily or skip to Acre. That was also the point where I realized we weren't actually going to get to the Holy Land.
No, I knew that from the very beginning. I knew that from the start. There's too much. It's like I said, you're drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah.
There's just so much stuff to deal with, and so much of it is so good that you can't leave it out too much. I had the luxury of a 4-book, at least, touch wood, at least a 4-book series, because I've got a contract for 4 books. So I can stretch my legs a little bit, and I can afford to really cover the journey in detail.
Well, that's what I realized. I thought, oh, we're in Portugal now. We've still got Sicily. We've still got Cyprus. This is going to take a while.
I managed to cram it all in somehow, and it's not a terribly long book either. It's shorter than any Ben Hope book, but to me, there's more going on. There's so much more going on.
Yeah,
and the second book is even more the case, because in the second book we're going to get to Acre. And so we've got the siege there, and then we move on from that. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a lot going on, a hell of a lot going on.
So we do finally meet Richard the Lionheart in Sicily. What do you think of him?
Well, he was a medieval king. He was like any other medieval king. He could not afford to be an angel or a soft touch. He was quite a remarkable man. He was much like his father in many ways, Henry, a real fighter, a real warrior, born to it. And he was more interested in that. He was more interested in really being a fighting man than he was a politician or a world leader or anything. In fact, there's a scene in the second book where Will has a good long conversation with him, and he pretty much says that. He says, I'm not really interested in all this stuff, all the splendor and playing the great man and all that. I just like having my sword riding into battle. He was a brilliant fighter, a brilliant soldier, a brilliant tactician. And there are lots of people who are very critical of him, and there were many bad things going on in England, and he was definitely neglectful of his country in many ways. I think he spent in 10 years he was king, he spent about 10 months or something in England. And that was just, he was only there to raise money for the campaign. So, but I mean, of course, we don't tend to remember that he wasn't just king of England; he was king of this whole Angevin Empire, which was huge. And who wouldn't rather be in France than in England anyway? The weather's better, the food is better. So if I'd been him, I think I'd have hung around in France more than England. But he's definitely no angel. But I kind of have this grudging admiration for Richard. He's got a fantastic sense of humor. He was quite cruel, wicked sense of humor. But there are things that he did that really make you laugh. We were going to talk later about the treatment of Isaac on Cyprus and what Richard did to him.
Well, let's get into it. Let's get into it now.
Yeah, okay. But what Richard did there makes you laugh. I mean, it makes me laugh anyway. It was hilarious. Very, very cruel, but very, very funny. So the story is, for those who don't know, Richard was sailing on his way to the Holy Land, and he stopped off first in Sicily, stayed there for ages, but he meant to go to Sicily, and he had some issues there to deal with, family issues, to say the least.
Yeah.
Then he was sailing on to Cyprus. He never really intended to conquer Cyprus, but something happened there that the Emperor Isaac Comnenus was playing with fire a bit. I think he had it coming, really, to be honest. He should have known. He should have known better. than to mess with Richard like this. There was a shipwreck, there was a storm, and many of the ships were, including one carrying Richard's bride-to-be, Princess Berengaria, and his sister, Joan or Joanna. Isaac wouldn't let them in, and a couple of the ships that had been washed up on the shore, he sacked them, and he imprisoned the people on board. He took all the supplies and gold that they had, and wouldn't release any of it. So by the time Richard gets there, Richard's not in the best of moods, not too pleased that the womenfolk had been disrespected and mistreated like this. He wasn't very happy that his ships had been sacked, his people thrown in prison. So obviously, Richard being Richard, puts on his armor and goes to war. I mean, you can't really blame the guy. And took the opportunity to conquer the entire island, make it his own. And at the end of this campaign, where Isaac, who'd been in hiding, some monastery somewhere on the tip of the island, he eventually surrendered. And he came to Richard and he said, please, please, Richard, be nice to me. Please don't throw me in irons. Please don't lock me up in iron shackles in front of my people, you know. And Richard said, oh, no, I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing, my dear chap, please. And then as a little aside to one of his men, and he says, go and make up some gold and silver irons and chains and shackles and make up a set of them. And this is what happened to Isaac, which I think is absolutely hilarious. Very, very dark humor indeed. So poor Isaac, who didn't want to be closed up in irons, ends up wrapped up in silver chains and gold chains instead, and thrown in prison. Spends the rest of his life in prison. You can say he had it coming, but then it was medieval times, and it was Richard. You know, you don't mess with him.
No.
I loved that episode, and I had to include that as well. So there's quite a lot of the book. It covers the conquest of Cyprus, which, of course, then became a very important strategic point for Richard. And it was relatively safe from the enemy. It was a brilliant trading port and a strategic place for landing troops and very, very useful. When the war was over, Richard then, I think he sold it to the Templars, and then the Templars ended up selling it on to someone else. I think they sold it to Guy de Lusignan. But Cyprus has always been a very important strategic point.
Yeah.
Even today. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think he did a good thing in grabbing Cyprus. I mean, who was this Isaac anyway? He was just this upstart from Constantinople. So here I come down on the side of Richard, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of think, well, had he not heard of Richard? You know, did he not sort of grasp that this was kind of somebody that you wouldn't want to mess with?
Yeah, what did you think was going to happen?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Hadn't news reached you about what had happened in Sicily with, what was it, Messina he ransacked?
Yes, yeah. There was lots of fighting going on at Messina, yes. And pretty much the same thing happened to the rulers there, you know.
Yeah.
Well, again, they'd messed around. His sister had been imprisoned. Her dowry had been basically stolen. And so Richard wanted it back, and he wanted her back, you know, and again.
Although we do have to qualify this with, yes, Richard wanted Joanna's dowry back for himself rather than Joanna.
That goes without saying. What was she going to do with it?
It went straight into his war chest.
All the same, it's a matter of principle.
Well, yeah, anyone, you can't mess with my sister. That's my job. Typical brotherly love, isn't it?
That's Richard. And I think these actions on his part pretty much speak for his character. I think we know who he was.
Yep.
In many ways, he's a very charismatic figure, and so he's featuring quite heavily in these books. Now it's more in the second one than the first, but we meet him in the first. But that was a great fun scene to write, where Will, who's just been, I won't spoil the plot for those who haven't read it, but Will's been in prison and he's released from prison and comes before Richard, who just so happens to be receiving a visit, and this is in Sicily, receiving a visit from his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his bride-to-be, his fiancée, is also there. And it's really thanks to the presence of the women that Richard looks favorably on Will at that moment and doesn't hang him. So, you know, he could be a very, very generous man. He was a very fickle man, I think. He was quite changeable. He was very moody. He could get extraordinarily angry that even his closest aides would be terrified of him. But he was also capable of great largesse at times.
I think he admired courage as well. You know, he admired the qualities that he saw in himself, if he saw it in other people, which is why I totally agreed with the way you had Will being forgiven.
Later on, Richard will look favorably on Will for something Will has done. In the second book, this is, and Will gets promoted. Because Richard would be just as happy to promote any commoner. I mean, it really was a meritocracy. You had to show that you had the chops, you know, to be worth that promotion, to be worth that position. So Richard basically says, "Look, I'm going to give you a go." Something that Will does early on in the story, which I won't tell you, is kind of an opening set piece, which was great fun to do. And Will distinguishes himself, and Richard hears of it, and as a result of that, then he says, "Okay, right, that was pretty good. You know, now I'm gonna give you this position and see what you can do with it." And he would do that. He would promote anyone he thought was simply worth it, rather than some baron's son or a noble. So yeah, he did value personal qualities and showed a lot, I think, of personal qualities himself.
Yeah. So you've alluded to a few things. It's starting off as a 4-book series. So what is next for Will Bowman?
Well, the next for me is book 3. the next for you guys out there is book 2, which is called The Knight's Pledge, and it's just a continuing story. I mean, the Ben Hope books were a series of books, and each one was kind of a standalone, or it could be read as a standalone, although obviously there was a thread running through them. But this is very much a serial, in the sense that you have episodes. Each book is an episode in an ongoing saga. So we will continue directly where we left off, which was standing on the eastern tip of Cyprus, looking across at the Holy Land. So now we're going to get back on our ship, and we sail across a relatively short stretch of water from Cyprus towards Acre, towards the port city of Acre, where this siege had been going on for already a long time. Richard was a very late arrival at the siege, and once he got there, it lasted about a month longer before he basically claimed the city and took over the place entirely. But it was a very eventful month. From there, then we marched down the coast, down to places like Jaffa, Ascalon. There was a battle at Arsuf, which actually, that's a huge battle that took place at Arsuf, and I didn't even have time to include it. I've had to skip over that battle, would you believe?
That's sometimes a good idea, though. You know, I think if you have just all battles, it becomes tedious. So it's good to mix up the sort of set pieces with the individual story and what's happening to the hero.
Yeah, because you need to separate your hero out from the mass of the army.
Yeah.
You need to find some way of making it more his or her story than just to do with, oh yeah, and then the army landed here, and then there was a big fight, and then they won or they lost. And as you say, it can be very repetitive and dull, which is one of my primary reasons for not including that big battle. Because again, Richard is just going to steal the show anyway, which he did. I've got on my wall of my study, I've got a big print of a scene from the Battle of Arsuf, and there's Richard on his big horse, just all clad in his armor with a big huge sword in his hand, and completely surrounded by Saracens with spears and maces and scimitars, and he's just riding into them and mowing them down. He pretty much stole the show wherever he went. So you don't want him stealing your hero's thunder. So the story then in the second book, again, I'm not going to spoil the plot, but there was a way in which the hero gets separated away from the army and has to go on a little mission of his own. So that was the reason I wasn't able to include that big battle, because I was focused on what Will was doing. There's a lot going on, an awful lot going on. By the end of the second book, we still haven't got to Jerusalem yet, so we've still got all that to come. As people know, obviously, the Third Crusade did not succeed where the First Crusade had succeeded in taking Jerusalem. The Third Crusade did not succeed in doing that. They came twice, I think, or 3 times within sight of Jerusalem, but they never actually took it. And then for military reasons, for tactical reasons, for political and personal reasons, Richard left. He went home. One of the reasons he went home at that point and just abandoned it was that Philippe of France, who had left sooner, quite a bit sooner after the siege of Acre was won, he went back to France. And of course, guess what? Moves on Richard's territories and possessions there. So Richard had to go home and sort that out, or at least he wanted to go home and sort that out. Didn't quite work out that way because Richard gets caught and kidnapped on the way home and is a prisoner of Leopold of Austria for a year in captivity, and then eventually gets released. And that's going to be in the third book. That episode, that whole incident, is going to be in the third book, and just go from there. So I'm finished the second book as of yesterday. I obviously need to spend a few. Well, you never really finish a book, do you? You just tinker with it until the day when you eventually have to hand it over. But I will now start looking at the third story. I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be a great fun.
It's a fabulous story. It's a fabulous story.
Well, I'm glad you like it. But I mean, for me, this is fun. It's fun doing this. The Ben Hope books were fun, but they could also be incredibly hard work and quite arduous at times. The hardest bit was always you had this hero who really wasn't a historian. He wasn't an archaeologist or any sort of stuff that you can do with Dan Brown, Robert Langdon.
Yeah.
There's a very good reason why, or Indiana Jones, there's a very good reason why these heroes can get embroiled in these stories. Ben Hope wasn't like that at all. He was a former soldier. But there was no real reason why he should get mixed up in any of this stuff. So that was always the hardest thing, was to try and find a valid reason why that would happen.
You should have had him doing history at Oxford rather than theology. It would have made your life so much easier.
I didn't know at the beginning of the series. I didn't know that it was going to go that way, really, and there were going to be so many books, and so that really became the biggest challenge of that series. By comparison, this one is so much easier in that way because your heroes, your characters are already there. They're already in the midst of it. It's harder in some ways because I'm doing something I've never done before, which is to fit very closely in with existing historical detail. And I'm really trying. I probably am getting things wrong here and there. I'm taking some liberties and some license. I know that, especially in the second book. And it'll probably get worse as I go on. but I'm trying to be authentic. I'm trying to be faithful to the original events as they happened, and just fitting myself into them in the best possible way. And I'm finding that it's challenging, sure, but it's challenging in a different way from the Ben Hope books were, and I think it's challenging in a more fun way.
Yeah.
I'm having a real good time doing this. This is my dream job. I hope it can go on. I'd love if the Will Bowman books. I don't want to jinx it actually by saying this, but if I could get 20 books out of it, I'd be so happy. Be so happy.
Yeah, me too.
20 books, 10 years, and then I can just go off and die somewhere. That'll be my life. That's me done. That's all I want.
Well, you may have to do a bit of a Bernard Cornwell jiggling with the age of Will by the end of it, though.
Not really. I've started him young. See, I did that on purpose. With Ben Hope, we started him. I think he was 36 or 37 or something when we first meet.
Yeah, something like that.
And then every so often you have to chuck in a flashback to stop the. Lee Childs had to do the same thing with Jack Reacher.
Yeah.
Jack Reacher was too old really to start when he started. I mean, he's already probably in his 40s, and he just gets older and older, and it becomes less and less convincing. Like James Bond, it becomes less and less convincing that this old bloke can attract these lovely young women. But with Ben Hope, it wasn't really aging in real time as such. He was a bit like James Bond in that way. He's just this archetypal, elemental hero who doesn't really age. But with Will Bowman, because you have to adhere to the actual event, the historical sequence of events. So obviously he is going to age with the clock. So I wanted to start him young. So he starts young, age 20 when we first meet him, 1190. And 20 nowadays is just a kid. But 20 in those days you were already, much more mature physically and emotionally. In every way, you were a much more mature person, man or woman. So I pretty much got it planned out that if I get to write all these books, I can pretty much take him through up to about the age of 60 something, and I'll always have something for him to do. So many things going on. And there were so many older guys who were in battle.
Oh, yeah.
Was it Simon de Montfort in the Albigensian Crusade? I think he was 60 odd.
Yes. Yeah, and William Marshall, he was in his 70s at the Battle of Lincoln, which Will Bowman will be able to fight with him, because Will Bowman will only be
Absolutely.
47 by that point.
And then look at Barbarossa. Look at Frederick Barbarossa, who was well over 70 when he set off on the Third Crusade, overland across Europe.
Yeah. Well, Eleanor of Aquitaine, she was in her 80s when she crossed the Pyrenees to collect her granddaughter to marry her to Philip's son Louis. So travel in those days, they were used to it.
Well, yeah, but she was an amazing lady, wasn't she?
Mm.
I love her. I think she's absolutely superb. I always think of her as Catherine Hepburn, from The Lion and the Winter.
Yep, same here.
Yeah. I think you couldn't have picked a better actress to play her. I'm not going to tell you more, but she's definitely going to become a recurring character because she's just so great.
Definitely.
There were so many great women in the Crusades. Yesterday, I was reading about this lady, Margaret of Beverley.
Yes. Yes.
She might be in. You might have written about her. I don't remember.
No, I haven't. I came across her about the time I was writing Heroines of the Medieval World, but I didn't have room for her. But she's one that she's on my list of people to go back to.
Now, she's quite a character.
Yeah.
And she was. I mean, she was a pilgrim. She traveled to the Holy Land. She was actually there at the siege of Jerusalem in 1187 when it was all happening. She got hit by a trebuchet stone, got injured, survived. You don't survive that kind of thing easily. You get hit by this bloody great big rock while flying at you. And she gets kidnapped later on. She's made captive, and she manages to get out of that, and then eventually comes back and ends up in a convent, I think.
Yeah.
At whatever age she died, I don't know, but what a life, what a story, incredible.
And one of my favourites is Richard's sister, Joanna. We've got Catherine Hanley coming on in a few weeks talking about her biography of Joanna, and she is just such a character and had such adventures, not always by choice. Richard dragged her around to the Holy Land with him, and it's like, but she did make the most of it.
Well, this is the thing, and there was such a colourful time, such an eventful time, that you were very liable to get plunged right into these things, events over which you had no control whatsoever, and you just had to deal with it. It was quite a remarkable period. There's just so much going on, so much going on.
Yeah, it's an amazing period for historical fiction, really, because as you've said throughout, you've got all this information. So, very, 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 very good book, and I'm sure that many of our listeners will either already have read it or will rush out and buy it when they hear this.
Well, thank you very much, Scott, because I really enjoyed The Pilgrim's Revenge, and I can't wait for the next one now.
Well, thank you for all your lovely comments on it, and thank you for all the support you've given it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's been a real pleasure to read it, actually. I'm the other way around. I actually do enjoy reading fiction because I write non-fiction. I'm all right with fiction so long as I'm not writing about that particular period at the moment, because if I do, I have to be careful because I might put some fiction into my non-fiction, which is, not good. So I do tend to look, but luckily I write mostly about women in history and not many, I can avoid reading about women in history if I'm reading about the Crusades.
I hope you like my female character in the second Will Bowman book. In the first one, obviously there couldn't really be one because the way the story went.
Yes.
It was a bit early for him to meet another lady, but he does meet someone at Acre, and so she becomes quite a prominent, quite important female character in the story. She's a bit of a composite figure from various ones that I was managed to glean little bits here and there about real women who were really there. There was one woman who was an archer. She was a lady, probably crossbow archer at the siege of Acre. She got shot. She got killed. Various other ones who sometimes survived and sometimes didn't. So I've created this composite of some real life women and created this character, which I hope you will approve of.
Sounds good.
I'm eagerly looking forward to it now. I hope so, because we tend to assume that women weren't involved because the chroniclers didn't write about them. They were there. It's just the chroniclers were trying to big up the men because they need it, of course.
And the women weren't just there to fetch water either. They were there, they were actively involved. As I mentioned, Margaret Beverley, she was there on the ramparts at Jerusalem, helping them, and was really very heavily involved in the actual combat. And there were others. There are some amazing stories. There's a story of a woman at the siege of Acre, and she was there with her husband. And their job was there was a great moat in front of a big ditch in front of the city walls, and the army were trying to get over this ditch so that they could scale the walls and position their ladders. So what they were doing was they were taking any bits of rock and stone they could find, and they were flinging them into these ditches to try and fill them up to make it easier to attack the walls. And this husband and wife team were there, and they were involved in that work. So obviously, a lot of rock and stone had to be used as ammunition for the trebuchets, to fire at the walls. But then there were bits of wall would be breaking off and bits of stone everywhere. So you'd be gathering up these great rocks and lumps of stone, chucking them into this ditch. And this woman, that's what she was doing when an archer, a Saracen archer from the ramparts, got her with a crossbow bolt, shot her in the chest. And as she lies dying in her husband's arms, she said, "Throw me in the ditch, help to fill it up a bit faster."
Oh dear.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that. The role of women, they did so much.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. It's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and I can highly recommend The Pilgrim's Revenge. I think everybody should go out and read it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I hope I haven't put people off reading it, those who haven't. But but I think it's a fun story. I think it's a fun story. So I hope other people will think the same. And so far so good. So far, so good. People who really seem to like it. I'm happy.
It's a great start to a new series.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for inviting me on this show, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Great to talk to you.
So thanks very much to Scott Mariani. Do join us next time when we will be talking with David Pilling about the Royal House of Gwynedd. So we're wandering into the history of Wales. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. Thanks for listening. Remember, you can catch us on YouTube, and it'd be great if you could give either a review or a like. See you next time.